I know Zelensky very well, and I know Putin very well. I have a good relationship, and that is a war that's dying to be settled. I will get it settled before I even become president. And what I'll do is I'll speak to one, I'll speak to the other, I'll get them together. That war would have never happened.
With President-elect Donald Trump boldly claiming he can end the Ukraine conflict in just one day, peace proposals and ceasefire deals are emerging everywhere as tensions in Ukraine escalate. For one, President Zelensky has made a sobering admission. Reclaiming Crimea by military means is no longer feasible. Meanwhile, Trump's team is proposing the creation of a demilitarized zone, and Turkish President Erdogan has proposed a 10-year freeze on Ukraine's NATO membership. But here's the real shocker. Vladimir Putin is reportedly open to discussing a ceasefire with Trump. His demands, however, are huge. And given Russia's recent advances in eastern Ukraine, there's a big question mark over whether Putin is genuinely serious about peace or just playing for time. And where are Europe's leaders in all of this? Honestly, they're barely in the picture. Apart from one controversial call from Olaf Scholz to Putin, which by the way ended with Russia ramping up military strikes that very same weekend, Europe seems sidelined. A troubling reality, considering any deal will likely affect Europe much more than the US. But we'll dive deeper into this later. For now, let's focus on the three peace proposals currently making the news: Trump's, Zelensky's, and Putin's. What are their objectives and how do they compare? Let's break them down. Let's start with our president-elect, Donald Trump. Now, while Trump himself hasn't laid out the specifics of his peace plan, his team certainly has. Figures like J.D. Vance have provided us a glimpse into what they're thinking. The core of the proposal is a ceasefire along the front line with the creation of a demilitarized zone, similar to the one separating North and South Korea. This would effectively freeze the conflict in its current state, which means Ukraine would lose nearly 20% of its territory, including Crimea in the south. But that's not all. To maintain this demilitarized zone, the plan would require European peacetakers, yes, troops, to enforce and protect the line. And lastly, Ukraine would also have to remain neutral, meaning no NATO membership and likely no EU membership either. Now let's turn to Moscow and examine what Vladimir Putin wants. Putin has firmly stated that the 4 oblasts in eastern Ukraine, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, and Crimea, belong to Russia, defended under the country's nuclear umbrella. Currently, Russian forces on the ground control 70 to 80% of the territory in these regions. In addition, Putin has voiced concerns that any ceasefire deal could simply serve as a temporary pause, allowing the West to rearm Ukraine for future conflict. Backing this sentiment, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov confirmed that freezing the conflict will not work in any way. This stance starkly contrasts with the US proposal, which aims to freeze the conflict along the current front lines. Putin, however, insists on solidifying control over the 4 oblasts entirely. That said, according to Reuters, 5 sources close to the Kremlin suggest Putin is open to discussing a Ukraine ceasefire deal with Donald Trump. Interestingly, they say the opposite, indicating that the Kremlin might agree to freeze the conflict along the current front lines and even consider negotiating the precise carve-up of the 4 contested oblasts. However, given this contrast with Putin's public rhetoric, it should be taken with a big pinch of salt. Putin also insists on Ukraine's neutrality, with no NATO membership. Additionally, he could push for Ukraine to limit the size of its armed forces and ensure there are no restrictions on the use of the Russian language within the country. Now, let's turn to Kiev and take a look at what Zelensky wants. For this, we can refer to Zelensky's 10-point peace plan from September and some of his more recent interviews. First and foremost, Ukraine demands the full withdrawal of all Russian troops from Ukrainian territory, which includes all of eastern Ukraine and Crimea.
We cannot legally acknowledge any occupied territory of Ukraine as Russian.
Zelensky has also been vocal about his opposition to freezing the conflict, arguing, much like Putin, that any frozen conflict will eventually reignite. He's pointed to Russia's renewed aggression after attempts to freeze the war in the Donbas following 2014 as a cautionary example. However, in a significant shift, Zelensky has recently admitted that reclaiming Crimea by military means is no longer feasible.
We are ready to bring Crimea back diplomatically. We cannot spend dozens of thousands of our people so that they perish for the sake of Crimea and come back. So we understand that Crimea can be brought back diplomatically.
Additionally, Zelensky wants very strong security guarantees, including NATO and EU membership. He has been clear that he will not accept Putin's suggestion to limit the size of Ukraine's armed forces, as this would leave the country vulnerable and indefensible against future aggression. Zelensky's 10-point peace plan also highlights the release of all prisoners and deportees, and he has repeatedly called for justice for what he claims are over 100,000 war crimes committed by Russia. The plan includes a demand for the establishment of a special tribunal to address Russia's aggression against Ukraine and to ensure Russia compensates for the immense destruction it has caused. So, if we compare all three proposals side by side, it's clear that they're miles apart. But you know what really stinks? Where's Europe in all of this? This war is being fought on our continent, and yet world leaders are tossing around peace plans over our heads. Even worse, Trump and Putin seem closer in their terms, and if negotiations come down to Trump, Putin, and Zelensky alone, Ukraine would inevitably be the weakest link, and European interests would almost certainly be ignored. This is especially concerning given the recent Russian advances on the front lines in eastern Ukraine and part of the Kursk region inside of Russia that Ukraine still holds. Add to that Trump's repeated threats to cut all military aid to Ukraine, and the pressure on Kyiv becomes overwhelming. Even Zelensky himself admitted on November the 16th that Kiev must do everything so that this war ends next year, through diplomatic means. In my opinion, Europe has failed spectacularly on this front. Germany keeps boasting that it's done the most for Ukraine after the US. But let's be real, no you haven't. Your support has been too little, too late, giving Russia months to prepare for what was coming. And when you look at support per capita, they're far behind smaller nations like the Baltics and Poland. And don't even get me started on France, Italy, and Spain, whose contributions have been even less. The consequences of this failure are devastating. Russia could emerge from this war looking like a winner, sending the dangerous message that declaring war on a smaller neighbor pays off, because you get to keep the land you seized. Worse, it could spur countries around the world to pursue nuclear weapons, seeing them as the only true deterrent against stronger neighbors. And finally, it would embolden authoritarian regimes everywhere. For one, Russia could start its next campaign against Georgia, Moldova, or even the Baltic states. Honestly, it's a scandal. Europe, with an economy more than 10 times the size of Russia, couldn't adequately support Ukraine in a way that matched the stakes of this war. Instead of a proactive, unified strategy, we've seen a reactive, piecemeal approach, always helping just enough to stop Ukraine from falling, but never enough to truly turn the tide. But what do you think? Which peace deal do you think will be implemented, if any? And we have another really cool video here about the impact Trump could have on Europe in his presidency. So be sure to check out our detailed analysis in this video here. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and share if you found this video interesting. And a huge shout out to our Patreons, especially our presidents, Jan, Sjoukje, BJ, Peter, Kristin, and AGVD. Your support makes this all possible.